Right, good afternoon. I'm Mr. Craven from the NET English Director Team, and I'm here with Mrs. Garbutt, Mrs. Potts, and Mr. Kofi, also from the NET English Director Team. And today we're going to be discussing Jane Weir's poem Poppies. Good stuff. Right, so why is this an interesting, or at least a useful poem, do you think? And if we start with Mrs. Garbutt.
I particularly like this poem because we get the mother's perspective of a son going to war. I particularly like it because we always imagine how the soldiers going to war and how they're feeling, and we often forget about the pain and suffering of the people who are left at home.
Absolutely,
so it allows us to understand.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of Jane Weir then, and the poem, we've had a brief conversation before we started recording, actually, haven't we? Do you think there's any relevance to Jane Weir herself, to the context of the poem? Any kind of backgroundy here that we need to think about, do you think? Mrs. Potts, any thoughts?
Obviously, we do know that.
Yes.
And
there's a family background thing, isn't there, as well?
And
yes,
I think that you can see that symbolism come through the way that she uses language and the way that she structures the poem. So I think that's something that's worthy of discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think she also has two sons as well, and she's explaining about how she would feel if her either of her sons.
In terms of her writing very much from a female point of view, and there is a trend, you're right, with the war poetry in terms of focusing on sort of men out in battle, and that's kind of the stereotype, isn't it? That kind of charge the light brigade, even sort of bayonet charge.
This is very unique, isn't it?
Isn't it? It's very different. And Jane Weir, I think often she focuses, doesn't she, on sort of marginalised voices in her work and that sort of thing.
I suppose.
Yeah, and the tendency we have to ignore those left behind, those back home.
And it's that civilian perspective.
Definitely, yes. And it was published, wasn't it, as part of a set of poems commissioned by Caroline Duffy.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Which was, I think, it was intended to come to bear witness to modern wars.
Right.
Do you think is that relevant to what we see here? Is that the idea she's going for with that?
I think so. I think it's quite universal as well in terms of this is something that perhaps is a modern idea that we're thinking about other perspectives than just the soldiers going to war, because obviously historically that's what we would have been thinking of, but actually exactly like Miss said about the thinking about those who are marginalised, giving a voice. You're thinking about the people left at home, you're thinking about these people who have been out throughout history but perhaps just haven't been able to have a voice, and I suppose that's the point of poetry, isn't it, to give people that voice and give them their perspective, so that we then think it's not just about the soldier and bayonet charge, it's about the mother who's left behind. And you can almost look at them kind of they're experiencing the same emotions, just one's in the house that's empty and one's in the war zone which is full of chaos.
Yes. So in simple terms then, I mean, would you agree that this is, on its most basic level, a poem about a mother saying goodbye to her son?
Yeah. And it's about the consequences of her emotions when he's gone, and how he is as an individual as well.
Yeah. So what are her emotions, do you think? I mean, where do we arrive with that?
I think we can see it. For me, there's a constant thread through it about how she tries to mother him, and that how she's desperate to have that communication with him when she wants to touch him, and she knows it's going to be exceptionally difficult. So for his lapel,
absolutely,
again. And for me, I think it's exceptionally emotive when she says, "I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose," and I think it reminds me of that child. She wants to bring that child back, however she knows that she can't do that as well.
And the idea, the reference to the gelling of the hair, I resisted the impulse. This idea, isn't it, of kind of respecting his boundaries as an adult, essentially, able to make those choices, and his choice about his own presentation and so on. And there's little kind of motherly touches. I love that you refer to the thread, by the way. Because I think there is the idea of threading all the way through this, isn't it? And the idea of that cloth work sort of things. Why is that, do you think? Why is there this central idea of the cloth going through this?
Yeah, I mean, my first reaction to that is this idea of mending and being emotionally mended. Whether you take the interpretation that the son has gone off to war, or you take the ambiguous meaning that he has actually left this world as a result of war.
To clarify, that's a valid interpretation or not. Yes, sure.
So then, in terms of, particularly at the end of the poem, and when she talks about that ornamental stitch, I think that's symbolism for the fact that she is relying on her memories of him, in particular her memories of him as a child, to mend herself.
I agree.
And those tucks, darts, pleats, the ornamental stitch, all things about joining things together.
And being mended.
Absolutely.
And going back to the ornamental stitch, if you take the idea that one stitch is singular, and the fact is that by itself it's insignificant, but to her her son is everything to many mothers who've suffered.
Absolutely.
And then the idea of the ornament, it's her pride, it's her place, because actually at the beginning of the poem, linking back to your original question about her emotions, she's incredibly proud of her son as well.
Yes.
Yeah. It's also interesting, isn't it? We start with that hint of the broader point of view with the 3 days before Armistice Sunday. I mean, just for anyone listening, can we just clarify that?
Well, doesn't it stem from the poppies from World War One?
Yeah,
yes.
The 11th of November.
Yeah, and we still use this every year to show our respect to the people who've fought for us.
Absolutely, yes.
Which I think is really key as well, because when you talk about the crimped petals as well, it really for me, it shows how things have always been kind of disjointed, and families have been hurt as well from war over time.
And as well, if you think about the poppies, it's obviously got the symbolic meaning of the World War One fields, but in a modern day environment where it is really broad, this could be a mother experiencing this pain or one going to war in any reign of life. Because it's universal.
There's almost a preemptive grief. We shift from this kind of individual, don't we, at the start, to what's that universal idea at the end. Absolutely. So in terms of the structure of the poem, then, I mean, what are the stages we go through with this? What do you think? I mean, is there a narrative to this? Is it a narrative poem? Where do we arrive at?
Big universal idea, and what I think from the start is this idea of the automatic thought is World War One, and I know that there's a lot of. I don't know how true it is, whether Jane Weir was inspired by Wilfred Owen's mother. I don't know how true that is, but the idea that Owen had died on Armistice Day when everybody else was celebrating, she was receiving the news that Wilfred Owen had actually died in the last few days of war.
Yeah.
But the fact, I think it starts, there's a thread of time all the way through it as well, and it starts 3 days before Armistice Sunday. And I always take that as a memory, what this poppy symbolises, what the mother's relying on, these memories of her son as a childhood. It's a continuous thing. It doesn't just happen on Armistice Sunday.
And it individualises it with the single, I pinned one onto your lapel, the individual shard.
And the individual war graves.
Absolutely, yes.
It could have just said, poppies had already been placed on war graves, so the poet wants to remember these individuals and the sacrifices that they made as people, not as numbers or statistics in a battle.
So, I mean, so the references just after that, reference to the poppy as well, the crimped petals, spasms of paper red, the blockaded yellow bias. There's almost like foreshadowing, isn't it, that of wounding, and that links to...
And the pain, the idea of spasm, being in that uncontrollable pain that you can't control.
Yeah.
Like, is the mother, later on in the poem, metaphorically in this emotional spasm?
Because I think as well, there's... I think it goes bigger and deeper than the war. I think it goes into kind of religious imagery as well. When you think about this idea of her perhaps being Jesus, you've got 3 days, Jesus in the 3 days,
tomb,
Sunday.
yes, absolutely.
I've never thought of the 3 days.
Yeah,
because then that links in later with the black thorns,
black
doesn't
thorns,
it?
Yeah, Jesus wearing the crown of thorns. So
absolutely.
I think it's that idea of, when I read this, I think, is she kind of empathising with Mary and the feeling of your son going to die, and whether she's thinking about that on a human level and thinking these were the emotions that woman would have gone through. This is a universal feeling for all these mothers going to war, or even mothers just saying goodbye to their sons who go off to university. There's this sense of loss and sense of kind of grieving that goes on.
Because the clothwork thing I also thought was interesting in terms of, because, fabric, isn't it? And the idea that the child's life, in a sense, is a fabric that the mother has woven. They've crafted this, they've shaped this over time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's an art.
It is, absolutely. Creating children is an art form, especially well-balanced ones, that sort of thing. So then when you send your child off to war, you're allowing the possibility of the destruction or damage to this thing that you have invested your life in. Images of clothwork and felt and so on, absolutely.
Yeah, but then I suppose you've got the end, the idea of when she uses a lot of the kind of the semantic field of clothwork with the skirting and the tucked darts pleats, but then we go to hatless without a winter coat or reinforcement of scarf gloves, this idea that she can't now put his coat on him and his hat and his scarf, like when you've always got this kind of domestic language and the military language combined, and maybe that's what the household is like for a military family.
See, I always read that line as she's actually vulnerable and she's aware that she hasn't got the reinforcements to help herself, because she's had to let her son go.
I had read that the same way, yes, absolutely. With that, the idea of kind of her lack of care for herself.
Yes.
It's because her entire focus is on her child, And leading her to skirting the churchyard walls, and the releasing of the bird just before that. I mean, the bird to start with. Why this image of the releasing of the bird, do you think, and the treasure chest what's going on here?
So interesting, because we've got that symbolism of released a songbird from its cage, and in the next line, that bird is now a dove, and I think that that's really important. So the way that I always read that, and I think we need to say this is probably one of the most ambiguous poems in the cluster, apart from...
Right, yeah.
I always read it, after you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Yeah. I think that is the mother, when the son has gone off to war, initially going in and grieving for the loss of her son, the fact that he hasn't died yet, but the fact is
the
that...
preemptive possibility of loss,
and
yes.
the idea that she, obviously, the cage and releasing it is the idea that she's setting him free in adulthood, and now he's flying. But I just think the fact that it then...
Sorry, but also possibility of her releasing her emotions at that point. It's both the imagery of the child, also her emotional state afterwards.
Yeah. And then that links back actually to the previous stanza, where there's that lovely oxymoronic phrase, because now she's letting herself go. Yeah. And because it's slowly melting.
And the stealing thing, I know, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier before we started recording, but the idea of stealing becomes like this military image, isn't it? But this is the female equivalent in terms of her bravery, as opposed to the kind of the weapons and the damage of, this is an emotional strength, isn't it? Very, very feminine strength.
Yeah. But also, it's another biblical allusion, isn't it? To Noah releasing a dove out of hope, finding a new land, and perhaps there's that sense of hope as well. She's waiting, she's the one who's stuck and stagnant, but she's hoping for news, she's hoping for that message that he's doing well.
And the irony, I suppose, in terms of the dove rather than leaning to the left, isn't it? That link to the path, the link to the universality of it. And you're right, it's the image of peace as well. Why the treasure chest, do you think, in terms of the world of the treasure chest and this idea of intoxication on the part of the son?
Because that's I always read that similarly in the sense of that's what the son views his experience is going to be. Because it's exciting, it's something that you want. So you've got his perspective of leaving, and that's what he's setting his sight on to achieve, and that contrasts to the mother's emotional state and the internal conflict she's in as a result of him going.
Yeah, because I've always read it as very similar, but the fact of like treasure chests, like adventure, but also the fact is that what he's after doesn't exist. It's like he thinks he's going to be like the soldiers in the war when the whole
heroic cavalry charge. There will be knights on horseback.
Yeah, we're all riding as heroes.
The grubby reality of the trenches and
and I think it's almost, I get the impression that it's that sense that she knows that and he doesn't. He's got that youthful, adventurous spirit, and she's thinking it's a treasure chest. It's just an illusion almost.
Yes, absolutely. Interesting. So, which brings us kind of to the end of this, doesn't it? In terms of this final stanza, we have these two half stanzas and these two longer stanzas in the middle, don't we? Why do you think she's actually used that in terms of that form?
Because I think she relaxes in this poem, isn't it? She's relying on her memories of him as a child.
Yeah.
And linked into the biblical reference earlier, it was actually in an option English class this week, and we were talking about the power of memory. We were talking about the biblical reference, especially of the blackthorns, and this idea of going back to Jesus with the fact that he sacrificed his life. And when Jesus sacrificed his life, and then the whole idea of resurrection and rebirth. And I just think it's really interesting. After the son has gone off to war, or whether you read it as after he has actually died in war, she then reverts back to the last line, hoping to hear your playground, back to him as a child, like she was in the initial flashback, where it talks about playing at Eskimos like we did where we were young. And I just think that's a lovely idea, the fact that for her to be reborn as a person, she's relying on her memories of her son as a child.
Yes.
And that's what gives that in the last stanza as well, where she goes to the war memorial, but she leans on it. So she's being supported, and it's that memorial which is symbolic of memory.
Yes.
What is she tracing?
And
is she tracing his
past,
name, or what is she tracing? It's ambiguous, we don't know. But the fact is that she's leaning. It's the memories of him as a little boy that's supporting her.
Yeah. You see, I mean, the way that I think I'd always interpreted it personally was the skirting the churchyard walls is skirting around the issue of death, the awareness of death, the possibility of death. And then arriving at the war memorial is that link to the past as well, the mothers from the past who had to...
Yeah, it links to the individual war graves at the beginning.
Exactly, yes. And that's the intellectual kind of, this is something going out throughout history. But she's almost supported by the strength of those in the past who've gone through the same thing.
Yeah, that's nice, like them both.
Yeah. I mean, the playground voice catching on the wind then. So finishing on that, the idea of, going with the idea of living through the past, living through the memories. I also quite like the idea of catching being both like playing catch and so on, but also catching almost like catching a thread or catching a clothwork, that sort of irritating little thing where it slightly pulls at the thread.
And then that links with the dove pulled freely,
doesn't it?
Against
with
the
one
sky.
little
So
stitch.
that movement, that physical distance.
Yes, very neat. Are there any stumbling blocks then with this poem, do you think? Is there anything on there that you think...
I think it's one of the high-end poems in the cluster. I think the idea behind it can be quite abstract because it's not concrete.
Yeah.
But I think that can also be a positive thing if you've got an idea about it, and as long as you can explain yourself and justify your reasonings and link it to the bigger ideas. Students have worried about what it actually means because it's not concrete.
No, it's quite open to interpretation in that sense, isn't it? Yeah. And from the individual to the broader ideas, I think, as long as people are happy with that. Yeah. And there are those common threads, as we were saying, of the unifying things of the clothwork and the unification of things and preemptive grief. Yeah. To one other poem from the anthology, what would you go for and why? I mean, Mr. Kofi, what would you go for?
Don't be stealing mine.
Oh, I don't know what it is.
See, Mrs. Potts, you can't see this, was right there ready, poised.
I think I'd go with my original bayonet charge idea, just because you've got the two perspectives on war. So you've got the perspective of somebody in the war, you've got somebody's perspective. I think it's quite neat because you've got this, almost like the son, because we assume this soldier was young and inexperienced from what we read.
And raw.
Raw, yeah. And the suddenness, suddenly I'm running, so...
Oh, and as well... Sorry, I'm getting excited.
Was that the same choice? Were you?
No, I wasn't.
No? Oh, right. No,
but also the idea, I always think by the end of being Bayonized, he has acknowledged the fact that the only way he's going to survive is by becoming a weapon. And maybe the mother's scared of that idea happening to her son. Yeah. And that intoxication.
Yeah, because you've got that contrast of language, having a very soft language in Poppies, a very harsh language in Bayonet Charge.
And the metal as well.
Yes. It's almost like what happens afterwards, isn't it? Because in Bayonet Charge, either king, honour, human dignity, etc. All these things which seem like grand ideas, like the treasure chest, exactly, and then abandoned by irrelevant when you're just trying to flip and survive on the spot. Yeah. That terror, his touchy dynamite, etc. Yeah, interesting. So, what would your choice be then, Mrs. Potts?
My choice would be based on the big idea of the power of memory, and obviously in Remains, you've got this soldier who, at the beginning, very similar to the soldier in Bayonet Charge at the end, he is a weapon of war at the start. He doesn't think about the consequences of his actions, and again, that lingo. Whereas the mother is fearful for what will happen to her son when he is intoxicated. Also, the thread of memories goes through both poems. In Poppies, the memory empowers her, and it gives her strength, it gives her hope, it gives her stability. She relies on it. Of the soldier in Remains killing the looter, it destroys him.
It's also, isn't it? It's interesting because in Remains, one of the big issues is the group at the start. So when they kill the looter, it's a group of them who do it. But then the aftermath of it, dealing with it, is the individual part, isn't it? Whereas in Poppies, what Jane Weir's also doing is bringing it down to the level of the individual. The individual child is her, and do it as an individual as well. And there is that group link in terms of the mothers of the past, the war graves and so on. But ultimately, it's her experience. So it's almost like Armitage and Weir are arriving at almost the same point, aren't they? That it's individuals in the end who have to deal with these things.
But also the sense of isolation that they both feel. They both feel like a sense of loss, but also that they're on their own, they're alone, what they're going through. They're both very different experiences having the same emotion, which I think is quite a nice link.
And as well, the fact that, apart from the looter being completely decimated by the dozen round of bullets, the main aftermath of conflict in both of these poems is the internal conflict that it causes on different individuals.
So although we have the playground voice, also the ideas of the war memorial, the war graves, and then in Remains, actually, the blood on the hands. In both of this motif of memory. Lovely. So what would your dream question be? If you go into that exam, what's the question you would hope to get on Poppies if Poppies came up?
Compare how poets present the power of memory or the power of the individual.
Yeah, good choice. And Remains would obviously think very closely.
I'd probably go quite vague and open, just so it gives me a chance to kind of dart around a bit. I would probably just go with the impact of war.
Yes, it's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, weave them back together.
Oh, that lovely note. There we go. Well, that's it for this podcast. So a huge thanks to all the English directors for taking part and taking the time to discuss this with us. And as ever, if you have any questions, do please talk to your teachers or to members of the English director team. and thank you for listening.